When one realizes that down at the feet and toes there are two phases that takes place, the potter's clay phase and the miry clay phase, well then Daniel 11 makes total sense. And we can understand who fights Christ at his coming after the tribulation during the day of the Lord. Now, as we read back in Daniel, the 2nd chapter, it says that these 10 toes are mixed with the miry clay. And then it says, in the days of these kings, the 10 toes mixed with the miry clay, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. And this corresponds perfectly with Revelation, the 17th chapter, verses 12 through 14, as we read before, that is the beast power with the 10 kings giving their power and strength to the beast, and these 10 kings fight Christ at his coming. These 10 kings are mixed with miry clay. So that is the miry clay phase that takes place after the tribulation, during the day of the Lord. But in Daniel, the 11th chapter, verses 40 through 45, it says the king of the north shall come to his end before the tribulation. When we understand the potter's clay and the miry clay phase, we can understand that this is the potter's clay phase. And the potter's clay is NATO. And of course, the king of the north is the president of the United States. And of course, this northern power is the European power, because it says here in Daniel the 11th chapter, verse 44, it says, tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. If tidings out of the east and out of the north are troubling him, obviously this northern power is in the east, in the west, and in the north, which is obviously Europe. And Europe is in an alliance with the potter's clay. And since the potter's clay is the house of Israel, and the United States founded NATO, the king of the north, it's not the king in the north, it's the king of the north. It's an alliance with, the potter's clay makes an alliance with the European power, and he is the king of it. The founder of NATO is the king of this northern alliance. It's not the king in it, it's the king of it. So the president of the United States is the king of the north. Now it says here, when we get on to this prophecy, in Daniel the 11th chapter, verse 40, it says, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Now here we see the king of the north, NATO, going into the Middle East. Now when NATO was founded, it was purely for the protection of Western Europe against the Soviet Union. And it was literally founded to protect Europe. What is the one event that had NATO leave its founding purpose of protecting Europe and have it go into the Middle East and fight a war in the Middle East? What is that one event that took place where this southern power was pushing at the northern power of NATO and caused him to come into the Middle East and attack the Middle East? That took place in the Gulf War of 1990 and 91. That was the first time that NATO ever left its original purpose and go into the Middle East and fight Saddam Hussein, who is the king of the South. Not the king in the South, but the king of the South. The southern Gulf states had an alliance, and Saddam Hussein joined that alliance and became the dominant player in that alliance. And that alliance was funding him, and he pushed at the king of the north with an oil embargo. And what we read in Daniel the 11th chapter, verses 40 through 43, is the Gulf War that took place in 1990 and 91. It says here, at the time of the end shall the king of the south, that's Saddam Hussein, push at him, that's the king of the north. And he did that with an oil embargo. Remember when he attacked Kuwait and he threatened the economies of the West with the oil embargoes? And so the king of the north at that time was, of course, George Bush Sr. When he got jostled, when he got pushed by Saddam Hussein, it says here, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. Do we remember the Gulf War, where the United States came at Saddam Hussein, many said, like a storm because of American air power that came against Saddam Hussein like a storm. And many have called the Gulf War the Whirlwind War because of American air power that came at Saddam Hussein and just destroyed and annihilated Saddam Hussein's cities and armies and so on. So it says that he came against him like a storm, like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. That was the greatest naval armada that took place since World War II. And this Gulf War carried more firepower than World War II. And of course, chariots and horsemen, we mobilized and moved a lot of troops throughout the Middle East with tanks and trucks and troops and so on. So it says, with chariots, with horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow, and passed over. The United States and NATO came into the Middle East, set up military bases all over the Middle East and Saudi Arabia. And it says, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. And they set up in Egypt and other places in the Middle East. So they overflowed and passed over. Now notice verse 41. And he shall enter also into the glorious land. Notice, he didn't attack the glorious land. He entered in. And if you recall, George Bush Sr. went into the glorious land. He was invited in. And the Israelis allowed the United States to set up Patriot missiles. So when Iraqi Scuds would come over Israeli skies, the Patriot missiles would fly off and intercept those Scuds, so none of the Israeli cities would be damaged. So he entered into the glorious land. Then it says, and many countries, is italicized and not in the original. It says, many countries, or many shall be overthrown. And when you look into the Farrar Fenton translation of the Bible, it says, many will fall. And if you recall, Saddam Hussein's million-man army fell before and submitted themselves before the U.S. and NATO. But it says, these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom, who is modern-day Edom. Our booklet online, if you want to read it, Turkey in Prophecy, shows that Edom is modern-day Turkey and a NATO partner. Moab, and we have another booklet, Syrian Prophecy, that'll prove to you that Moab is modern-day Syria. And the chief of the children of Ammon. Notice the Bible makes a clear distinction here. It says the chief of the children of Ammon. Ammon is modern-day Jordan. And it says that the government of Jordan sided with the king of the north. And it did. It is actually documented that the government of Jordan sided with the NATO allies, but the people of Jordan were with Saddam Hussein. And the Bible makes this clear distinction, and it's actually documented, and we document that in that booklet, Middle Eastern Prophecy. It says, and he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries. And if you recall, the United States had no-fly zones and controlled the airspace of many of those countries in the Middle East. And the land of Egypt shall not escape. The U.S. and NATO controlled Egypt at that time during the Gulf War. Verse 43. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver. And it means the economies of these nations. The U.S. also controls many of the economies of these Middle Eastern nations. And over the precious things of Egypt. And the precious things of Egypt is the many ports that Egypt has, especially the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was vital for the United States to bring in supplies, to bring in fuel to fight Saddam Hussein. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps or at his submission. If you recall, the Libyans, and it should read modern-day Sudan, these two nations were against the United States, going against Saddam Hussein. So the United States, through the UN, slapped sanctions on these two countries. So they were at his submission. So the Gulf War was prophesied in your Bible. The king of the north is NATO, and this is describing the Gulf War in great detail.